Don't be bitter. Your husband is gone and we're taking the house. Cry and pack your bags, my daughter-in-law whispered. I smiled because I had been expecting this moment. Then I said just one sentence that froze her blood. The greedy one fainted at the truth. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The funeral home smelled like wilted lilies and false sympathy. I sat in the front row, my hands folded in my lap, watching people I barely knew offer their condolences about Harold's passing. 43 years of marriage, and most of these faces were strangers to me. But that's how it had been for the last 5 years, ever since Lance brought Ember into our lives. I felt her presence before I saw her. Ember had this way of sucking the warmth out of any room she entered. She slid into the seat beside me, her black dress perfectly fitted, her makeup flawless despite the occasion. Even at my husband's funeral, she looked like she was posing for a magazine. Such a shame about Harold, she whispered, but there was no emotion in her voice. It was the same tone she used when commenting on the weather. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The grief was still too raw, too close to the surface. Harold had been my anchor for over 4 decades, and now I felt like I was drowning in a sea of uncertainty. Ember leaned closer, her perfume overwhelming. We need to talk after this, Mabel, about arrangements. Something in her tone made my stomach clench. I turned to look at her, really look at her, and saw something cold gleaming in her green eyes. This wasn't grief or concern I was seeing. This was calculation. The service dragged on. Lance stood at the podium, delivering a eulogy that sounded more like a business presentation than a son mourning his father. He'd changed so much since marrying Ember. The warm, caring boy I'd raised had become this distant stranger who barely looked at me anymore. After the burial, people gathered at our house, my house. The thought hit me with sudden clarity as I watched Ember move through the rooms like she already owned them, directing the caterers, accepting sympathy with practiced grace. I was standing in the kitchen trying to find a quiet moment when Ember cornered me. Lance was nowhere to be seen, probably hiding in his father's study like he always did when things got uncomfortable. Mabel, we need to discuss your living situation, Ember said, her voice low but firm. She glanced around to make sure no one could hear us. My living situation? I repeated, confused. Ember sighed dramatically, as if explaining something to a child. Look, I know this is hard, but you can't stay here forever. Lance and I have been talking, and we think it would be best if you found somewhere smaller, more manageable for someone your age. The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the counter, feeling the room spin slightly. This is my home, Ember. Harold and I built this life together. Built it for Lance, she corrected, her mask slipping just enough for me to see the venom underneath. Harold always intended for this house to go to his son. You're 59, Mabel. You're still young enough to start over somewhere else. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. The audacity of it took my breath away. Here I was, barely 3 hours after burying my husband, and this woman was already trying to evict me from my own home. Where is Lance? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Ember shrugged. He agrees with me. We've discussed this extensively. He just finds these conversations difficult. You know how emotional he gets. That was a lie. Lance had never been emotional about difficult conversations. He'd always been direct, honest, willing to tackle problems head-on. At least he had been before Ember came along. Don't be bitter, Ember continued, her voice taking on that false sweetness she used when other people were around. Your husband is gone, and we're going to keep the house. You should cry, pack your bags, and move on with dignity. The words hung in the air between us like poison. I felt something crack inside my chest, but it wasn't grief this time. It was something else entirely. Something that had been building for 5 long years of watching this woman manipulate my son, isolate me from my own family, and systematically destroy everything Harold and I had worked for. I looked at Ember's perfectly made-up face, at the satisfaction barely hidden behind her fake concern, and I smiled, really smiled, for the first time in weeks. Oh, Ember, I said softly, my voice carrying a tone I hadn't used in years. You sweet, foolish girl. Her confident expression faltered slightly. What's that supposed to mean? I leaned closer, close enough that she could see the truth in my eyes, close enough that when I whispered my next words, only she would hear them. "You really think Harold was stupid enough to leave everything to Lance without protecting me first?" The color drained from Ember's face so quickly I thought she might be having a stroke. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She grabbed the counter for support, her knuckles going white. "What? What are you talking about?" she stammered. I straightened up, still smiling that same calm, knowing smile. "The house, the accounts, the investments. Everything you've been counting on. Everything you've been planning for. Harold knew exactly what you were after, Ember. And he made sure you'd never get your hands on any of it." That's when Ember's legs gave out. She crumpled to the kitchen floor in a dead faint, her perfect facade finally cracking along with her consciousness. I stood there for a moment, looking down at her, feeling something I hadn't felt in 5 years. Power. The sound of her hitting the floor brought Lance running. He found his wife unconscious on my kitchen tiles, and me standing over her with the strangest sense of peace I'd felt since Harold's diagnosis. Lance cradled Ember's head in his lap, his face pale with worry. "Mom, what happened? Did she say something to upset you?" The question stung more than it should have. When had I become the problem in my son's eyes? When had my presence become something that could upset his precious wife? "She just fainted," I said calmly, reaching for a glass of water. "The stress of the day, I suppose." Ember's eyelids fluttered open, and she immediately locked eyes with me. I saw the fear there, raw and undisguised. Good. She was finally beginning to understand that she'd underestimated me. "I'm fine," she whispered to Lance, struggling to sit up. "Just felt dizzy for a moment." But she wasn't fine. Over the next 3 days, I watched Ember spiral into something close to panic. She followed me around the house like a shadow, trying to gauge what I knew, what Harold might have told me. She searched through his desk when she thought I wasn't looking, rifled through our bedroom, even went through the mail with desperate intensity. It would have been amusing if it weren't so pathetic. Lance, oblivious as always, attributed his wife's strange behavior to grief. "She really loved Dad," he told me one evening as we sat in the living room. "She's taking this harder than I expected." I nodded sympathetically while Ember shot me warning looks from across the room. If only Lance knew that the only thing his wife had ever loved about Harold was his bank account. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle that even I hadn't seen it at first. When Lance brought Ember home 5 years ago, she'd been charming, attentive, eager to please. She'd complimented my cooking, asked about family history, seemed genuinely interested in becoming part of our lives. But slowly, things began to change. Family dinners became less frequent. Lance started making excuses for why they couldn't visit. When they did come over, Ember would steer conversations away from family topics, always redirecting toward Lance's work, his future, his potential. She had a gift for making suggestions that sounded like concern. "Don't you think your mother works too hard maintaining this big house? Wouldn't she be happier somewhere smaller, more manageable?" Or, "Lance, you're so generous with your parents, but you need to think about our future too." Harold had seen through her from the beginning. "That girl's got $signs in her eyes," he'd told me after their engagement party. "She's not marrying our son, she's marrying our assets." I'd defended her at first, wanting to believe that Lance had chosen well, that he'd found someone who would love him the way I loved Harold. But as the months passed, Harold's warnings proved prophetic. Ember began dropping hints about our outdated lifestyle, suggesting that Lance deserved better, that we were holding him back. She complained about the time he spent with us, made him feel guilty for enjoying family traditions that had been important to him his entire life. The final straw came last Christmas. Harold and I had always hosted a big family gathering, but Ember announced that she and Lance would be spending the holidays with her family instead. When Lance protested, she'd gotten tearful, claiming that we made her feel unwelcome, that she never felt good enough for the Winters family. Lance, desperate to keep peace, had chosen her side. We'd spent Christmas alone for the first time in 30 years. That's when Harold began making his preparations. Now, watching Ember pace the living room like a caged animal, I remembered the conversation Harold and I had shared just 3 months before his death. He'd been weak from the chemotherapy, but his mind was still sharp as a tack. "I've been to see Mitchell," he'd told me, referring to our attorney. Made some changes to the will, set up some protections. That girl's not getting her hands on what we've built, Mabel. I won't let her destroy our family's future. He'd explained everything to me then, every detail of his legal maneuvering, every safeguard he'd put in place. At the time, it had seemed like overkill, the paranoid musings of a sick man who didn't trust his daughter-in-law. Now I realized it had been genius. Mabel, Ember's voice cut through my memories. She was standing in front of me, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. I think we got off on the wrong foot the other day. I was emotional, not thinking clearly. I looked up at her, noting the strain around her eyes, the barely controlled desperation in her voice. Of course, dear. It's been a difficult time for all of us. About what I said, about you finding another place to live. She forced a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. That was completely inappropriate. This is your home. I would never suggest otherwise. Wouldn't you? I asked mildly. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. I just think we should all take some time to process Harold's passing before making any big decisions about anything. Translation: she needed time to figure out what Harold had done, what protections he'd put in place, how she could circumvent them. That's very thoughtful of you, Ember, I said, setting down my teacup with deliberate care. But I'm afraid some decisions have already been made. The color drained from her face again. What do you mean? Harold was very thorough in his planning. He made sure I'd be taken care of, that our wishes would be respected. I smiled at her, the same knowing smile I'd given her in the kitchen. He was such a wise man, don't you think? Ember's breathing became shallow, rapid. Mabel, if there's something specific you want to discuss, maybe we should include Lance. Oh, we will, I assured her. When the time is right, when all the paperwork is in order. Mitchell is handling everything, of course. Harold trusted him completely. The mention of our attorney's name made Ember sway slightly. She gripped the back of the sofa for support. I should go check on Lance, she mumbled, practically fleeing from the room. I sat back in my chair, feeling more peaceful than I had in years. For so long, I'd been the victim in this story, the naive mother-in-law who couldn't see what was happening to her family. But Harold had given me the tools I needed to fight back, and I was finally ready to use them. The war was just beginning, and for the first time, I held all the weapons. The appointment with Mitchell was scheduled for Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Harold's funeral. I'd called him myself, ignoring Ember's increasingly frantic attempts to insert herself into the conversation. I think I should be there, she'd said for the 3rd time that morning, hovering in the kitchen doorway as I prepared breakfast. As Lance's wife, I have a right to know what's in Harold's will. I cracked an egg into the pan, watching it sizzle in the butter. The reading is for immediate family only, dear. I'm sure Mitchell will share whatever Lance wants you to know. Her jaw tightened. I am immediate family. Are you? I asked, turning to face her fully. Because for the past 5 years, you've made it very clear that you consider Harold and me to be obstacles, not family. Ember's mask slipped again, revealing the cold calculation underneath. I've never said anything like that. You didn't have to. I flipped the egg with more force than necessary. Actions speak louder than words, don't they? That afternoon, Lance and I sat in Mitchell's oak-paneled office, the same office where Harold and I had planned our future together decades ago. Lance looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his wedding ring in a way that reminded me painfully of his father. Mitchell cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he opened the thick manila folder containing Harold's final wishes. Before we begin, I want to say how sorry I am for your loss. Harold was not just a client, but a dear friend. Lance nodded stiffly. Thank you. Can we just get through this? I reached over and squeezed my son's hand, surprised when he didn't pull away. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to come running to me when he scraped his knees. Of course, Mitchell said gently. Now, Harold made some significant changes to his will in the months before his passing. He was very specific about his intentions and asked me to explain his reasoning along with the legal details. Lance straightened in his chair. What kind of changes? Mitchell looked at me, and I nodded for him to continue. Your father was concerned about protecting your mother's security and ensuring that his legacy would be preserved for future generations of the Winters family. I don't understand, Lance said. Dad always said the house and everything would come to me when they were gone. And it will, Mitchell assured him. Eventually. But Harold established what's called a life estate for your mother. She has the right to live in the family home and access to all necessary funds for the remainder of her life. Only after her passing will the property transfer to you. I watched Lance's face carefully, searching for signs of the manipulation Ember had been feeding him. Instead, I saw relief. That makes sense, he said quietly. Mom should never have to worry about having a place to live. My heart swelled with love for this man who was still, underneath all of Ember's influence, the good son Harold and I had raised. But Mitchell wasn't finished. There's more, Lance. Your father also included specific protections against what he termed undue influence. If anyone attempts to pressure your mother into giving up her rights or transferring property prematurely, the entire estate goes to charity. The color drained from Lance's face. What does that mean exactly? It means, I said quietly, that if anyone tries to force me out of my home or manipulate me into signing over my inheritance, they lose everything. Lance stared at me, understanding dawning in his eyes. Ember, he whispered. Mitchell nodded gravely. Your father was very specific about this provision. He mentioned concerns about certain family members who might not have your mother's best interests at heart. But surely that wouldn't apply to Lance, I said, watching my son's reaction carefully. Harold knew that Lance would never hurt me. Of course not, Mitchell agreed. The provision specifically protects against third-party influence. If Lance were to, say, pressure you at the urging of someone else, that would trigger the charitable clause. Lance buried his face in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. Oh God, Mom, what has she done to us? The drive home was silent. Lance gripped the steering wheel so tightly I worried he might snap it in half. I wanted to comfort him, but I knew he needed to process this revelation on his own. When we pulled into the driveway, Ember was waiting on the front porch, her smile bright and expectant. She practically bounced down the steps to meet us. How did it go? She asked, linking her arm through Lance's. I've been so worried. Was everything straightforward? Lance gently but firmly extracted himself from her embrace. We need to talk. Something in his tone made Ember's smile falter. Of course. About what? Inside, Lance said curtly, heading for the house. I followed them into the living room, settling into Harold's favorite chair while Lance began to pace. Ember perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped in her lap, trying to look concerned rather than calculating. The will was interesting, Lance began. Dad left everything to Mom for her lifetime, then to me after she's gone. Ember blinked rapidly. Everything? But surely he meant for us to— There's a clause, Lance interrupted. If anyone tries to pressure Mom into giving up her rights, the entire estate goes to charity. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Ember's face cycle through a range of emotions. Confusion, understanding, rage, and finally, fear. I don't understand why Harold would do something like that, she said carefully. It's almost like he didn't trust his own family. He didn't trust everyone in his family, I said pointedly. Ember's head snapped toward me. What's that supposed to mean? Lance stopped pacing and stared at his wife. It means Dad knew exactly what you were planning, Ember. He knew about your little speech to Mom at the funeral. Ember's face went white. What speech? I was just trying to help. Help? Lance's voice was rising now. You told my mother at my father's funeral that she needed to pack her bags and get out of her own home. I never said that, Ember protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I stood up slowly, feeling years of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. Yes, you did. You stood in my kitchen, 3 hours after I buried my husband, and told me that I was too old to manage this house. You said Harold always intended for it to go to Lance, that I should start over somewhere else. Ember looked frantically between Lance and me. You're twisting my words. I was emotional, grieving. You were calculating, I said coldly. Just like you've been calculating for the past 5 years. Did you really think I didn't notice how you've been poisoning Lance against us? How you've systematically tried to separate him from his family? That's not true, Ember said. But tears were starting to flow now, and I couldn't tell if they were real or just another manipulation. Lance sank onto the sofa beside his wife, but didn't touch her. Is it true, Ember? Did you really tell Mom to pack her bags? Ember's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. Everyone always comparing me to your perfect family, making me feel like an outsider. I thought if we had our own space, our own life, things would be different. So you decided to throw my mother out of her home to make yourself more comfortable? Lance's voice was dangerously quiet. I didn't mean it like that, Ember sobbed. I just wanted us to have a future together, without always living in your parents' shadow. I looked at this woman who had nearly destroyed my family and felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. She was so consumed by greed and insecurity that she'd thrown away the only real love she'd ever had. Lance stood up, his decision clear in his posture. Pack your bags, Ember. You're the one who needs to find somewhere else to live. Ember didn't leave. Instead, she dug in like a tick, refusing to accept that her carefully laid plans had crumbled. For 3 days, she followed Lance around the house, alternating between tearful apologies and cold accusations. She's poisoned you against me, I heard her tell Lance one evening through the thin walls. Can't you see what she's doing? She's manipulating you just like she manipulated your father. I was sitting in the kitchen, pretending to read while actually listening to their argument upstairs. The irony of Ember accusing me of manipulation wasn't lost on me. My mother didn't manipulate anyone, Lance replied, his voice strained with exhaustion. Dad saw right through you from the beginning. That's not true. Harold loved me like a daughter. He told me so himself. The lie was so audacious it took my breath away. Harold had barely tolerated Ember's presence and everyone knew it. But desperation makes people say terrible things. When? Lance asked. When did he ever say that to you? A long pause. You're being cruel, Lance. I'm grieving too. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Then Lance appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. Mom, can we talk? I set down my book, noting the dark circles under his eyes. Of course, sweetheart. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed him breakfast before school for 18 years. I don't know what to do about Ember. What do you want to do? Lance rubbed his face with both hands. I want her to leave, but she keeps saying she has nowhere to go, that her family won't take her in. She's making me feel like the villain. And how does that make you feel? He looked up at me with Harold's eyes, full of pain and confusion, like I'm losing my mind. She's making everything about her, even Dad's death. She keeps talking about what we've lost, what this means for our future. I reached across the table and took his hand. What does your heart tell you? That Dad was right about her, that I've been blind for 5 years. His voice cracked. I'm so sorry, Mom, for all of it. For choosing her over you and Dad, for missing Christmas, for letting her make you feel unwelcome in your own home. Tears stung my eyes. You don't have to apologize for loving someone, Lance, even when they don't deserve it. But I should have seen it. The way she talked about you when we were alone, always finding fault, always suggesting you were too dependent on Dad, too set in your ways. He shook his head. I thought she was just trying to help me become more independent. She was very good at making her selfishness sound like concern, I said gently. That's when Ember appeared in the doorway, her face blotchy from crying. So, this is how it's going to be? Mother and son plotting against the evil wife? Lance tensed. We're not plotting anything, Ember. We're talking about our family. I'm your family, she screamed, all pretense of composure gone. I'm your wife. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It used to, Lance said quietly. Before I realized what you really wanted from me. Ember's face contorted with rage. What I wanted a husband who wasn't still attached to his mother's apron strings. I wanted a man who could make his own decisions without running to Mommy for approval. The venom in her voice made me flinch, but Lance just stared at her with something like pity. I want you out of this house by tomorrow, he said calmly. Take whatever belongs to you and go. And if I refuse, then I'll have you removed. Ember laughed, but it was a bitter, broken sound. You think you can just throw me away? After 5 years of marriage? You threw us away first, Lance replied. The moment you decided my parents were obstacles instead of family. After Ember stormed out, Lance and I sat in heavy silence. I could hear her upstairs, slamming drawers and talking loudly on the phone, probably calling reinforcements. I was right. The next morning, I woke to find 3 cars in my driveway. Ember's sister, Madison, had arrived with her husband and teenage son, along with Ember's mother, Patricia. They stood on my front porch like an invading army, all sharp suits and righteous indignation. "Mrs. Winters," Patricia said when I opened the door, "we need to discuss this situation with Ember and Lance." "I don't think that's necessary," I replied calmly. "This is between my son and his wife." "When it involves throwing a young woman out of her home with nowhere to go, it becomes everyone's business," Madison interjected, pushing past me into the foyer. I felt a flash of anger at the intrusion, but kept my voice level. "This isn't Ember's home. It never was. She's been living here for 2 years," Patricia said, following her daughter inside. "That gives her certain rights." Lance appeared at the top of the stairs, his jaw set in determination. "Actually, it doesn't. Ember was never on the deed, never contributed to the mortgage, and never had any legal claim to this property." "Legal claims aside," Madison said, "there's such a thing as human decency." "Yes, there is," I agreed. "And your daughter has shown precious little of it over the years." Patricia drew herself up to her full height, which wasn't very impressive. "How dare you speak about my daughter that way?" "The same way she spoke about my husband at his funeral," I shot back. "Or did she forget to mention that part?" The room fell silent. Ember appeared behind Lance on the stairs, her face pale but defiant. "What exactly did you tell them, Ember?" Lance asked. "I told them the truth," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "That you're choosing your mother over your wife." "What truth?" Madison demanded, looking between her sister and Lance. "What happened at the funeral?" Lance descended the stairs slowly, his gaze never leaving Ember's face. "Your sister told my mother, 3 hours after we buried my father, that she needed to pack her bags and get out of her own home." The gasps from Ember's family were audible. Patricia stared at her daughter in shock. "Ember, tell me he's lying," Madison whispered. Ember's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "It wasn't. I didn't mean it like that. I was emotional, not thinking clearly." "You were thinking very clearly," I said. "You'd been planning this for years, waiting for Harold to die so you could claim what was never yours." "That's not true," Ember protested, but even her own family was looking at her with doubt now. Patricia sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Ember, how could you say such a thing to a grieving widow?" "Because she's greedy and heartless," Lance said bluntly. "Because she never loved me or this family. She loved what she thought she could take from us." Ember's facade finally cracked completely. "Fine!" she screamed. "You want the truth?" "Yes, I wanted this house. Yes, I wanted the money. Do you blame me? Do you know what it's like being married to a man who consults his mother about every decision, who spends every holiday and birthday catering to his parents instead of building a life with his wife?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even her own family stared at her in horror. "Get out," Lance said quietly. "All of you, get out of my house." Patricia stood slowly, her face flushed with shame. "Ember, go pack your things. You're coming home with us. I'm not leaving without what I'm owed," Ember said stubbornly. "You're owed nothing," I told her. "And if you keep pushing, you'll trigger the charity clause in Harold's will. Then Lance loses everything too." Ember's eyes widened as the full implications hit her. She'd been so focused on getting her hands on our assets that she'd never considered she might destroy them entirely. "You're bluffing," she said, but uncertainty crept into her voice. "Am I?" I pulled out my phone and showed her Mitchell's contact information. "Shall we call him and find out?" Ember stared at the phone, then at Lance, then at her horrified family. Finally, the fight went out of her. "Fine," she whispered. "You win." But as she turned to go upstairs and pack, I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. This wasn't surrender. This was the look of someone planning one final, desperate gambit. Ember disappeared for 3 days after the confrontation with her family. Lance tried calling her multiple times, worried despite everything that something might have happened to her. I knew better. She was planning something, and when desperate people plan, they usually make their worst mistakes. On Friday morning, I got my answer. I was in the garden, tending to Harold's roses, when a black sedan pulled into the driveway. A man in an expensive suit got out, followed by Ember. She looked different somehow, harder, more determined. The man carried a briefcase and walked with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Mrs. Winters?" The man approached me with a practiced smile. "I'm Robert Kellerman, Mrs. Ember Winters' attorney. We'd like to speak with you about a legal matter." I straightened slowly, my arthritis protesting the sudden movement. "What kind of legal matter?" Ember stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "The kind that's going to get me what I deserve, Mabel." I looked between them, noting the predatory gleam in the lawyer's eyes. These people had the look of sharks circling wounded prey. Too bad for them I wasn't as helpless as they assumed. "Perhaps we should go inside," Kellerman suggested. "This involves your son as well." Lance appeared on the porch as if summoned, his face grim. He'd been expecting this, I realized. He knew Ember better than I'd given him credit for. In the living room, Kellerman opened his briefcase with theatrical precision while Ember perched on the edge of the sofa like a cat ready to pounce. "Mrs. Winters," Kellerman began, "my client has been the victim of what we believe constitutes elder abuse and undue influence." I blinked slowly. "Excuse me?" "You've manipulated your son into choosing between his wife and his mother, creating an emotionally abusive environment that has damaged their marriage irreparably." Lance laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's rich coming from Ember. Furthermore," Kellerman continued, "the will your husband left appears to have been created under suspicious circumstances, a man dying of cancer, potentially under the influence of pain medication, making dramatic changes to his estate planning in his final months." My blood ran cold. They were going to challenge Harold's will, claim he wasn't competent when he made those crucial changes. "That's a lie," I said quietly. Harold's mind was clear until the very end. Was it? Ember leaned forward, her eyes bright with malicious triumph. "Because I have documentation suggesting otherwise. Medical records showing the pain medication he was taking, records of confusion and disorientation." "Documentation you obtained how?" Lance demanded. Ember shrugged. "I was family. I had every right to be concerned about Harold's condition." The pieces clicked into place. During Harold's illness, Ember had insisted on accompanying him to several doctor's appointments, claiming she wanted to support the family. I'd thought it was unusually considerate of her. Now I realized she'd been gathering ammunition. "Even if you're right," I said carefully, "challenging the will would be expensive and time-consuming. Are you prepared for that kind of legal battle?" Kellerman smiled like a shark scenting blood. "Mrs. Ember Winters has secured financial backing for this endeavor. She's also prepared to file additional claims regarding the emotional distress she suffered and the financial losses incurred due to your manipulation of family dynamics. In other words," Lance said flatly, "you're going to try to bleed us dry with legal fees regardless of whether you win or lose." "We prefer to think of it as seeking justice," Kellerman replied smoothly. I studied Ember's face, noting the desperate edge beneath her confident facade. This was her last play, and she knew it. If this didn't work, she'd have nothing left. "What exactly do you want?" I asked. "Half," Ember said immediately. "Half of everything. The house, the investments, the accounts. It's what I would have been entitled to if Harold hadn't been manipulated into changing his will." "And in return?" "We drop all legal challenges and Ember signs a complete release of any future claims," Kellerman said. Lance stood up abruptly. "Get out, both of you. Get out of our house right now." "Lance," Ember's voice took on that wheedling tone she used when she wanted something. "Be reasonable. This could drag on for years. Think about the stress, the expense. Wouldn't it be better to just settle this and move on?" "Move on?" Lance stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. "You want me to give you half of everything my parents worked for their entire lives, after you told my grieving mother to pack her bags at my father's funeral?" "That was a misunderstanding." "It was the truth," Lance shouted, his composure finally cracking. "For once in your life, you told the truth about what you really wanted." Ember's mask slipped, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Fine. You want to fight? We'll fight. But when this is over, you'll have nothing left but legal bills and regrets." "Then that's what we'll have," I said quietly, standing to face her. "Because I will not give you one penny of what Harold and I built together." Kellerman cleared his throat. "Mrs. Winters, I should warn you that contesting a will on grounds of mental incompetence often results in the entire document being invalidated. If that happens, the estate would be distributed according to state law, which typically favors the surviving spouse and children equally. The threat was clear. If they successfully challenged Harold's will, I could lose everything anyway. There's just one problem with your theory, I said, walking to Harold's desk in the corner of the room. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a manila folder I'd been saving for exactly this moment. "What's that?" Ember asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "Video recordings," I said calmly. Harold recorded himself explaining his will changes, his reasoning, and his mental state on 3 separate occasions. He was very thorough about establishing his competence. The color drained from Ember's face. "That's not possible." He also recorded a statement about his concerns regarding your intentions toward this family. Very detailed concerns, based on conversations he'd overheard and behaviors he'd observed. I looked directly at Ember. "Would you like me to play that recording for your attorney?" Kellerman's confident demeanor faltered. "I'd need to review any such recordings to determine their admissibility." "Of course you would," I agreed. "But I think you'll find Harold was quite articulate about his daughter-in-law's character, or lack thereof." Ember shot to her feet, her face flushed with rage. "You're lying! Harold never made any recordings, didn't he?" I opened the folder and pulled out a DVD in a clear case. Harold's neat handwriting on the label read, "Final Testament, Mental Competency Documentation." Lance stared at the DVD, then at me. "Mom, is that real?" I handed it to him. "Your father was a thorough man. He knew exactly what Ember was capable of, and he prepared accordingly." Ember lunged for the DVD, but Lance pulled it away from her reach. She turned on me with fury I'd never seen before. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Sitting there with your secrets and your precious recordings. But you're just a bitter old woman who can't stand the thought of anyone else being happy." "No," I said quietly. "I'm a widow who protected her family from a predator." Kellerman was already packing his briefcase, clearly recognizing a losing battle. "Mrs. Winters, perhaps we should reconsider our strategy." "There is no strategy," Ember screamed. "Don't you see? She's had this planned all along. She and Harold, plotting against me, recording conversations, setting traps. Actually," I said, "Harold and I were just protecting ourselves from exactly this scenario. And judging by your reaction, we were right to do so." Ember looked around the room wildly, like a cornered animal seeking escape. When her gaze landed on Lance, her expression shifted to something almost pleading. "Lance, please. I know I've made mistakes, but I love you. Doesn't that count for something?" Lance looked at the woman he'd married, and I saw the exact moment when the last of his illusions died. "If you loved me," he said quietly, "you wouldn't have spent 5 years trying to destroy my relationship with my parents. You wouldn't have waited for my father to die to show your true colors, and you certainly wouldn't be trying to steal my inheritance." Ember's face crumpled, but this time, her tears looked genuine. "I never meant for it to go this far." "Yes, you did," I said. "This was always your plan. You just never expected us to be ready for it." Kellerman cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps it would be best if we left and reconsidered our options." "There are no options," Lance said firmly. "It's over, Ember. Accept it and try to find some shred of dignity in how you leave." As they walked toward the door, Ember turned back one last time. The look she gave me was pure poison. "This isn't over, Mabel. You may have won this battle, but you've lost your son. He'll never forgive himself for choosing you over me." "Maybe not," I replied, "but he'll never forgive himself if he doesn't." The door closed behind them with a finality that seemed to echo through the house. Lance and I stood in the sudden silence, both of us emotionally drained from the confrontation. "Is it really over?" Lance asked. I looked at the DVD in his hands, thinking about Harold's foresight and the protection he'd built around our family. "For now," I said. "But Lance, I need you to understand something. I never wanted it to come to this. I never wanted to see you hurt." He nodded slowly. "I know, Mom, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see what she really was." But even as we held each other, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ember's parting words carried the weight of prophecy. She was right about one thing. Lance would struggle with guilt over this decision for years to come. The question was whether our relationship could survive that burden. 6 months passed before Lance and I talked about Ember again. She'd left town after the failed legal challenge, and according to mutual acquaintances, had moved back to her hometown in Ohio. There were rumors of a new relationship, someone else she could target with her particular brand of charm. I tried not to feel satisfaction at that news, but I couldn't help hoping her next victim would be more perceptive than my son had been. Lance had thrown himself into work after the divorce papers were finalized, staying late at the office and traveling more than necessary. When he was home, he was polite but distant, carrying himself like a man who'd been badly burned and wasn't sure who to trust anymore. On a crisp October evening, I found him sitting on the back porch, staring at the garden where I'd been working when Ember's lawyer had arrived. He had a beer in his hand and the look of someone wrestling with old ghosts. "Mind if I join you?" I asked. He gestured to the chair beside him without taking his eyes off the roses. "Remember when Dad planted those? Your first summer home from college," I said, settling into my seat. He wanted to surprise me with something beautiful to look at while I did the dishes. "He was always thinking about you like that," Lance said quietly. "Little gestures, small kindnesses. I never appreciated it until now." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the trees. Finally, Lance spoke again. "I keep thinking about what you said that first day, when Ember fainted in the kitchen, about Dad knowing what she was after." "He did know," I confirmed. "He saw through her from the very beginning, but he never said anything directly to me." I considered my words carefully. "Your father believed in letting people make their own choices, even when he knew they were wrong. He thought you needed to figure out Ember's true nature on your own." Lance took a long sip of his beer. "He must have thought I was an idiot." "No," I said firmly. "He thought you were a good man who wanted to see the best in people. That's not a character flaw, Lance. It's one of your greatest strengths. It almost cost us everything, but it didn't. That's what matters." Lance turned to look at me for the first time since I'd joined him. "How do you do it, Mom? How do you forgive so easily?" The question caught me off guard. "What makes you think I've forgiven anything?" "You're not angry. You don't seem bitter about what happened, about what she put us through." I thought about that for a moment, surprised to realize he was right. Somewhere along the way, the rage and hurt had faded, replaced by something closer to peace. "I think," I said slowly, "it's because Ember never really hurt me. She tried to, but she failed. Your father protected me from the worst of it. And you chose family in the end. That's all I ever really wanted. Even after everything I put you through, all the times I chose her over you and Dad." I reached over and took his hand, noting how much it resembled Harold's. "You didn't choose her over us, sweetheart. You chose to honor your marriage vows, to try to make your relationship work despite the problems. That shows character, not weakness." Lance's eyes filled with tears. "I miss him so much, Mom. Dad always knew what to do, what to say. I feel so lost without his guidance." "You're not lost," I assured him. "You're just finding your own way. And you're doing better than you think." "How can you say that? I nearly let Ember destroy everything Dad worked for." "But you didn't let her," I pointed out. "When it really mattered, when you finally saw who she truly was, you protected our family. That's exactly what your father would have done." We talked until well after dark, covering ground we'd avoided for months. Lance shared his guilt over missing the warning signs, his anger at being manipulated, his fear that he'd inherited some fatal flaw that made him vulnerable to people like Ember. I told him about the recordings Harold had made, the careful legal protections he'd put in place, the way he'd anticipated every move in Ember's playbook. Most importantly, I shared Harold's final conversation with me about Lance. "He said you were the best thing we'd ever created," I told my son. "That no matter what mistakes you made, you had a good heart and strong moral compass. He never doubted that you'd find your way back to us eventually." "He was more confident than I was," Lance said with a shaky laugh. "He knew you better than you knew yourself." As we prepared to go inside, Lance stopped me with a gentle touch on my arm. "Mom, I have something to tell you. I've been offered a promotion at work, but it would mean relocating to Denver." My heart sank, but I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity." I turned it down. I blinked in surprise. "Why?" Lance looked out at the garden one more time before answering. Because I realized I don't want to run away anymore. This is my home. These are my roots. And you're my family. I'm not going to let anyone or anything separate us again. The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. Lance, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he said firmly. Dad spent his whole life building something here, creating a legacy for our family. It's time I started honoring that instead of running from it. A year later, Lance moved back into his childhood bedroom while he looked for a house nearby. It was temporary, we both insisted, just until he found the right place. But somehow, neither of us seemed to be in any hurry for him to leave. We'd settled into a comfortable routine. Lance handled the heavier maintenance around the house while I managed the daily operations. We shared cooking duties and took turns choosing what to watch on television. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, this quiet partnership between a mother and her grown son. The house felt alive again, filled with purpose and warmth. Harold's roses bloomed more vibrantly than ever, as if they approved of the renewed harmony in their garden. On the anniversary of Harold's death, Lance and I visited his grave together. We brought fresh flowers and spent an hour sharing memories, telling him about the changes in our lives, the peace we'd found in his absence. "Do you think he would approve?" Lance asked as we prepared to leave, "of how we handled everything with Ember?" I looked at Harold's headstone, remembering the man who'd loved his family fiercely and protected us even beyond death. "I think he'd be proud," I said. "We didn't let her win, and we found our way back to each other. That's all he ever wanted." As we walked back to the car, Lance slipped his arm through mine in a gesture that reminded me painfully of his father. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly. "For what? For not giving up on me, for fighting for our family, for being stronger than I ever knew you could be." I patted his hand, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from a battle well fought and a family well protected. "I had excellent teachers," I replied, thinking of Harold's wisdom and Lance's ultimate loyalty. "And I had something worth fighting for." The drive home was peaceful, filled with the comfortable silence of two people who'd weathered a storm together and emerged stronger on the other side. Ember was just a memory now, a cautionary tale we'd share someday with future generations of our family. But for now, it was enough to know that we'd survived her attempts to destroy us. We'd protected what Harold had built, preserved the legacy he'd wanted to leave behind, and proven that real family bonds couldn't be broken by greed or manipulation. As we pulled into the driveway of the house that would always be our anchor, I felt Harold's presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. He'd done his job well, my clever husband. He'd made sure that love would triumph over avarice, that family would survive the attempts to tear it apart. And in the end, that was the only victory that really mattered. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.